Okay, I'm getting the high sign that we're on. It sounds like the microphone's on, so you have a good chance of hearing me. Welcome to our Wednesday night Luke class. Good to see everybody. Everybody's bundled up. A little cool in here. I thought about putting my jacket back on, but maybe moving around and talking will warm up. We're looking at chapter 6 tonight, if you'll be turning there. I had given you a couple of pieces of homework, one of which I don't think we'll get to tonight, and one that we will, I think, after a little bit of discussion. The one that we won't get to was for you, that you'll probably have another week to think about, was the question of what's the difference between chapter 5 and chapter 6. There's a significant difference between the two chapters, and it's not really a trick question. I think it will be kind of obvious, but maybe something that would help is to think about a different place where chapter 5 ends and chapter 6 starts. And of course, as you know, the application of chapters and verses are arbitrary. It's what folks have put in to help us to get to the same place in our studies. Luke didn't write in chapter and verses. I would end chapter 5 at the end of verse 11. It makes chapter 6 then kind of short, which is probably why they didn't do it, but I think it makes more sense in terms of the kinds of thoughts that are going on. And so when you're thinking about the difference between chapter 5 and chapter 6, divide the chapter right there. And I think it'll kind of become a little bit clear what I'm getting at. And again, I don't think we'll get to that discussion tonight. We're going to start tonight at the beginning of the chapter again. We spent a little bit of time on the disciples going through the field and eating grain, and we'll overlap with that a little bit. But we have a couple of incidents here where the Sabbath and what Jesus and his disciples are doing on the Sabbath is an issue. And I want us to spend a few minutes talking about the Sabbath. Okay? Tell me what you know about the Sabbath.
It's a time of rest.
Okay, it was a time of rest. Okay.
It was a day to dedicate to the Lord, so no work, no...
Okay, it was a holy day.
Yeah.
Okay.
That doesn't mean you couldn't do anything at all.
Okay.
Just like
Okay.
working your job and such.
Well,
I mean, there were things.
it was pretty prescribed what you could do and couldn't do, and in
Yeah.
fact, the Pharisees had gone to the length of trying to define every instance of what was work and what wasn't work. Okay.
I mean, yeah, there were certain things you could and couldn't do. Like you
Okay.
had to prepare your food the day beforehand, but it
Okay.
wasn't as restricting as they made it out to be.
Okay, and we'll come back to that thought in a minute. Okay. Other things that you know about the Sabbath.
It was commanded very early on to remember it and keep it holy.
Okay. In fact, where do we find that? Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy.
Exodus 20, verse 8,
Okay, as part of
the Ten Commandments.
the Big Ten. Okay, it was one of the Big Ten. Okay. So, Casma.
And not only was it commanded to be kept holy, but the people, God's people, were commanded to keep it for generations to come.
Okay, all right. For us, what day of the week was the Sabbath?
Saturday.
Okay, Saturday, okay. If you grew up like I did in the Bible Belt, folks over the years have tried to apply Sunday as sort of the, sort of the new Sabbath. And I grew up with my parents not doing any yard work or mowing the grass or doing any, repairs or any of that kind of stuff. Doctrinally they would teach that, it's really not the Sabbath, it's Sunday, but, it's a good idea anyway just to keep the day holy because, good things happened on Sunday, on a Sunday. Okay? And some of that still is around.
Personally, I prefer to have 2 days of the week off.
Okay. If you enjoy weekends, guess where they came from? They grew out of the idea of the Sabbath and having a day. That didn't come from the pagan gods. That didn't come from the unions in Rome. Okay? That's a direct outgrowth of this idea that you're going to work a few days and you need some rest. Okay? And so it has an influence even today. So as we get into these stories about the Sabbath and all of the rules and the regulations that there were about it, are these stories just examples of the Pharisees standing around looking for Jesus to do something wrong so they can nitpick him? Is that what's going on here? Clearly they're looking to see how he's obeying the law, but are they just nitpicking here?
No, I mean, they deeply felt they were protecting the law, the Judaism, whatever, as we call it, I guess, or protecting the people from themselves, sort of.
Okay. And that's an important concept as we look at these stories and try to understand the magnitude of what is going on. Unfortunately, often we think in very legalistic terms. And when we get to thinking about the Sabbath and all of this stuff, we almost get to thinking about Pharisees because the day becomes something defined by what you can't do instead of what it was intended for. Yeah, back here in the back.
I just unmuted myself and forgot what I was going to say for a moment. Wait, I got it. Sometimes it's very easy for people, such as the Pharisees, but also us in general, to get too focused on the yeses and nos,
Okay.
just strictly following what it says, while often forgetting why the law is the way
Okay.
it is.
Okay.
And for the weekend, for example, the Sabbath, it's not, doing no work for the sake of doing no work because work on that day is bad. It's to encourage us to rest from the work we did all the other days.
Okay. And that's pretty much exactly what the Pharisees did with the Sabbath, is they turned it in instead of a day of rest. And the blessing and you go back and you read the Old Testament scriptures, the Sabbath was given to Israel as a blessing. Not, okay, here's a day where I'm going to see how much how obedient I can get you to get. And the Pharisees had turned it and defined it as all the things you couldn't do instead of a blessing. There's another aspect of the Sabbath. I just ran across this the other day. I'm always intrigued by things that we find out from Jewish culture and history about the Old Testament that just are not in our frame of reference, mainly because we didn't live in those times and we weren't brought up in that culture. And it's the idea that many times the things that God did in the Old Testament was in direct contrast and repudiation of idols and false gods and the pagans and the things that they believed. One you may be, example, maybe you're most familiar with is when you look at the plagues in Exodus. Each one of those plagues can be lined up with one of the false Egyptian gods. And so throughout that whole process of Moses going and saying, let my people go, God's going to do this. So one by one, God is showing that he is more powerful than any of the Egyptian gods. Of course, culminating with Pharaoh, who was considered to be a deity by taking his firstborn. Okay? Well, it turns out in the pagan cultures. Well, let me ask you this question first before I tell you this. Why did God rest on the seventh day?
Because creating the universe in the first 6 days was pretty exhausting.
Okay. Was God tired? Okay. You know, I appreciate that answer. God was not tired. He wasn't worn out. Man, I got to take a nap. Okay. One of the great blessings of being retired is you get to take naps. God was not worn out.
Well, he was finished, did everything he needed to do in 6 days, so
He
why.
was done. I'm finished, okay? Any of you guys ever do a home improvement project, or maybe you do a craft or an artwork or something, and you get done with it, and you just want to, okay, you never get done with it, okay. There is this theory that people get done with stuff, and when they get done, they stop and they sit back, and they enjoy it. They look at, this is what I did. You know, I'm glad to be done, but I'm finished. I'm done now. In the pagan cultures, particularly in Baal worship, the teaching in early Hebrew times was that the god Baal created his temples in 7 days. It took him 7 days to create his temples. Okay? So liberal scholars say, oh, Judaism just borrowed from all those pagan cultures. No, God, one, created more than a temple. He created everything that is. And guess what? It didn't take him 7 days. He was done in 6. And he got to sit back and enjoy his creation. Say, look, I'm done. And so the Sabbath grows out of this. I'm done. And I rested from the things that I did. And you Hebrews, you should do the same thing. It's good for you. It's good for you to do that. But the Pharisees had taken it and made it into something that, how miserable can we make you? How many hoops can we put out there for you to jump through to find out if you really want to be right with God? We're doing it. Okay? And there was actually a teaching during Jesus' time about the Messiah and the Sabbath. And that was, we Pharisees do all these things right, and there's so many people, they try to keep these laws, and they can't do it. The truth is, the Messiah is going to come when Israel finally obeys the Sabbath. So here comes Jesus teaching, ostensibly thumbing his nose at the whole idea. So when the Pharisees see what the disciples are doing with the grain, and when we get to the guy with the withered hand a little bit later on tonight, it's not a minor thing. It's not a, oh, you didn't come to Sunday school last week, or you don't go to church on Wednesday nights, so, you know, it was much deeper and much more profound than that. I had a comment back here.
I was just going to say, so in other words, they're turning the Sabbath into an insurance company.
Into an insurance company? Oh, okay, if you keep it, yeah, okay, kind of like the idea of being a Christian is fire insurance kind of thing. Okay.
You got to do this, you got to do this. Oh, we're not going to,
okay.
if you did that.
Oh, I got you. I see what you're saying. Okay. All right, well, let's read those first few verses in chapter 6 again. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, "Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" And Jesus answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. And then Jesus said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Okay, any other day of the week, what the disciples were doing was perfectly fine. And in fact, the law said, you know, if somebody came through your fields and they were hungry and they need, you need to let them take some grain. But the Pharisees had defined that picking the grain was reaping and rubbing the grains to get the husk off was winnowing, and that, they were doing work. How did the Pharisees know what the disciples were doing?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if Jesus had a paparazzi following him 24/7.
Okay. We're going to see the closer that he gets to Jerusalem, the crowds get bigger and bigger and bigger. There are, of course, his disciples traveling with him. There are those who are following and listening and wanting to see the signs and wanting to hear the teaching. And we've also, as we saw at the beginning of chapter 5, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law have shown up from Jerusalem for the purposes of checking out Jesus to see if he's kosher, see if he's legitimate. And they're already, they came in kind of leery because there had been other folks that folks thought were the Messiah. And Jesus is not doing and saying the kinds of things that they expect. And again, understand that this is more than just, we got you, we're going to tell on you. These guys have got authority to take legal action against Jesus. And so not only is this idea of the Sabbath serious, but these guys are in a position to do something about it, and they're watching. And I don't know where they are amongst the folks, or how many folks are traveling with Jesus at this point, but they're there and they see this. It's interesting that when Jesus went in to eat with Levi, that they got hold of the disciples to ask them. Sounds like they're getting a little bolder, because now we've got a real violation here of the law. So, looks like they're going to Jesus and the disciples directly. And so we talked about this some last week, and we talked about Jesus' response, that he brings up the example of David eating the showbread. And I think maybe I said, I don't recall exactly what I said, but I may have said this wrong. Every Sabbath, I think I said every day, but every Sabbath, under the law, there were 12 loaves of bread that were made and put on the altar for the Lord. And they stayed there until the next Sabbath, and then they were taken away and fresh loaves were put out. And the loaves that were taken out were designated by the law of Moses to be for the priest to eat. Okay. And so Jesus brings up the example of, well, David broke the law, and you don't have any problem with him doing that. And before we pull on that thread, we ended last week with the idea of, it was sort of this expedient thing that David needed because he was on the run from Saul trying to kill him. Okay, this is right after Jonathan, shooting the arrow and telling him, yeah, he's going to kill you. You got to get out of here. And so he goes in here with his men, and they're hungry. They're on the run. And so it's expedient. And he goes into the priest and he says, we're hungry. You got anything to eat? The priest says, all we got is the bread here. You can have it. Okay? 1 Samuel says the priest gave it to him. The priest didn't tell him, no, you can't have it. It's only for us. The priests, who are a lot more compassionate than the Pharisees could ever dream of being, says, here, you guys have it. And so I posed the question, this was the other part of your homework, is this the story that we can use to let ourselves off the hook when we want to do something otherwise that probably we wouldn't do, or that folks would think might be wrong? Is this our exculpatory clause? for being able to rationalize sin.
Well, I was about to say it depends on if it actually is wrong or not.
Okay?
And then you said is sin, which rationalized sin, which it would not, because it would have no way of rationalizing sin to begin with. It was given by the law to the priest,
Okay.
and so the priest gave it to.
Okay. We could have that discussion, and that's a line of thought. But it sure sounds like, and Jesus poses it as a David broke the law. Okay? He did something worse than these disciples are doing, eating the grain. So what's your problem? He goes a little bit further, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But he lifts up this example as you guys are not complaining about David breaking the law, and doesn't argue with him that David broke the law. Okay. Any other? If it's, I think we know, we sense inherently that this, this is not our get out of jail free card. Okay. We sort of know that, but why isn't it? Ronnie.
Because there's a need more so than
Okay.
a tradition. The needs are more important than tradition.
Okay. Needs are more important than tradition, and I think we could have a great argument and a great justification for doing things different that aren't defined by Scripture because it's expedient and we're helping somebody. Okay? And even the law allowed for that. If your animal had fallen down in a well on the Sabbath, it wasn't work to get them out. If you had somebody in physical peril to go save their life on the Sabbath, the law allowed for that. But this is something where the law said this is for the priests, and David broke the law because it was expedient. He was hungry. Okay? All right.
Other than the man posing this question, you can look back at the history of any single person, no matter how great you think that person might be, and you can pick times out of their history where they sinned, where they did something they weren't supposed to. David's got several examples.
Okay. So maybe Jesus' argument is just, look, David broke the law and you guys don't have a problem with it. He did something much worse than these guys are doing, so why you have... Maybe that's the thrust of Jesus' argument. Okay?
I was going to get to this. The important part is that what David needed and his companions needed was more important than what the law was doing. It like this, the purpose the law served wasn't as important as what the needs were, and would have overall been more detrimental to follow it than to break it.
Okay. It's still the conundrum that he broke the law. Okay. I think the key is in what could the Pharisees have said about David? Who was David? Okay, he was the anointed king. Okay, now Saul was anointed king. And earlier in Samuel, when Saul tried to offer sacrifices that only priests could offer, Samuel came to him and said, God has taken the kingdom away from you. Okay, we always think that Saul lost the kingdom with the Amalekites because he didn't kill them. He had already lost the kingdom when the Amalekites came up. He lost the kingdom because he tried to act as a priest and a king. Who do we know of that are priests and kings? Two I can think of. Melchizedek, okay? That's for all of the things we don't know about Melchizedek, the real comparison that's made in Hebrews between Melchizedek and Jesus is that he was a priest and a king. And that Jesus likewise is a priest and a king. Where did Jesus come from physically? The line of who? The line of David. So David is not only the anointed one as a king, he's also the anointed one through whom the Messiah is going to come. And so what they could have said is, well, David was the anointed one. He had the authority to do that. They don't say it, but Jesus gives them the response anyway that he could have given them if they had said out loud what perhaps they were thinking. He says, "The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Now, what did that mean to the Pharisees when he said that? What's the term Son of Man mean? We covered it in chapter 5. He used that term with himself in chapter 5. And we pointed out that it's readily recognized by the Pharisees as a messianic term. Okay, he's applying it from Daniel to himself. Yes, did you have something?
Well, I was just going, I had only raised my hand to say what it was because I
Okay,
figured someone else would
okay.
have done it already.
So Jesus is saying, I'm the Messiah. I get to say what is what. I have the authority to do it. Okay, so this is not just, he throws out a Bible phrase and keeps walking and hopes that it kind of confuses them. It's, look what David did. There was a time and authority to do that. I have more authority than David did. I'm Lord of the Sabbath. And I just got to imagine he kept moving and these guys had to pick their jaws up off the ground. Okay, very, it's so much more than a just, do you believe you have to go on Sunday morning, Sunday nights, Wednesday nights, in order to be right? It's like, I'm Lord of the Sabbath. I'm what you guys are waiting for, but you don't recognize it. So we have that happen. And then in verse 6, let's read the next section. On another Sabbath, he went to the synagogue and was teaching. And a man was there whose right hand was shriveled. The Pharisees and teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. But Jesus knew what they were thinking and said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Get up and stand up in front of everyone." So he got up and stood there. And then Jesus said to them, "I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it?" He looked around at them all and then said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He did so, and his hand was completely restored. But they were furious and began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. Okay, so Jesus has been traveling around the countryside, teaching, healing, interacting with folks. He's still showing up at synagogues and teaching. And so he shows up at the synagogue, and there's this guy there with a withered hand. What's he doing there? Probably was considered unclean because of his deformity. You suppose maybe he was brought in as a test case? Did you see what Jesus did in the field and how he talked to us? You're going to be over here at the synagogue next week. I tell you what, we just need a little more evidence, and man, we can prosecute. So let's I know this guy. Let's get this guy in there and let's see what Jesus does with him. Now, I am speculating. I am reading into this. Not that far-fetched. But even if it's none of that, it's not none of that because it says explicitly that the Pharisees were looking to try to catch Jesus and doing something wrong. And so this guy was there, and whether they brought him or not, it's like, let's see what he does. And so what does Jesus do?
He doesn't just heal him, he makes not a show, he makes a display out of it. He says,
maybe a statement. He makes a statement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He doesn't just say stand up, he says stand up in front of everyone.
Okay.
I'm going to show them what I can do.
I want you guys to see what I'm about to do. Not see me after service, we'll go in here in the elders' prayer room and, we'll take care of this little problem. Nobody needs to know about it. It's like, I want you to stand in front. Is he trying to embarrass this guy? No, he is trying to make a point. And he tells this guy who, until Jesus says this, can't stretch out his hand. He can't do it. Okay. Before he does, what does he do? Before he tells this guy, before he heals him, before he tells him to stretch his hand out, what does Jesus do? He asked a question. Okay, he knew what they were thinking, and he asked a question. And what's the question? Okay, is it right to heal or to destroy on the Sabbath? Okay, we've already established, and there would be no argument, if this guy had fallen down in a well and Jesus was saving his life. But did he have to heal that hand on the Sabbath? Could he not have said, it's a Sabbath and we're not going to heal, so I'll be here, I'll meet you here Monday morning. Okay? Or, we won't argue about the Jewish calendar and their time, whatever, but, for the sake of keeping things simple, just meet me back here Monday morning and we'll take care of this and it'll be fine and nobody's feathers will be ruffled, it'll be fine. But he says, is it right to heal or to destroy? Who was trying to destroy? Is there somebody in this story who was trying to destroy?
Well, yes, the Pharisees were after Jesus.
Okay. The Pharisees were there to destroy. Were they there to destroy the guy with the withered hand? They were there to destroy Jesus. And so when Jesus asked this question, is it okay to heal, which you can't do, or is it okay to destroy, which you are trying to do? You're breaking the Sabbath by being here trying to catch me and trying to destroy me. If you read the version in Mark, when Jesus does this, Mark says he was angry. It says Luke just says he looked at them all. This is not going to be Capernaum where everybody rushed Jesus and tried to rush him out over the top of the mountain and stone him and he walked through them. This is, we ain't even approaching, we can't say nothing, we can't do nothing. And I have an idea there wasn't a whole lot of eye contact going on. That as Jesus asked this question, those got to be, folks got to be really familiar with the tops of their sandals or whatever, footwear they were wearing. This was bold and in front and making a statement. And he says, stretch your hand out. And when he does, it's like it gets energized as he does it. And he's healed. It's clear. Everybody sees it. This is not Jesus healing the leper and saying, don't tell anybody what I did, just go show yourself that this is in front of everybody. Because Jesus is making the point that I'm Lord of the Sabbath. Okay? Something greater than your legalistic, narrow-minded, missing the whole point of what the Sabbath is about is here in front of you. And it says that they were furious and began to plot what they could do. It's either Mark or Matthew says that not only were they furious, they went out and sought out the Herodians and began to scheme with them. So the Herodians were Jews that supported King Herod. Okay? The King Herod who threw John the Baptist in the jail and had him beheaded because John the Baptist spoke out about his open sin. The last folks in the world that the Pharisees had any sort of spiritual respect for were the Herodians, because they were in bed with Herod, who was in bed with the Romans. And they are so furious and so blind to where they have gone with this that they're willing to scheme with them to kill the Messiah. The irony of this is just huge. Okay. Any other thoughts about these stories and about Jesus' handling of the Sabbath? There's actually an application in the time of Luke to this. And maybe one of the reasons why this story shows up in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. What do you suppose one of the biggest problems in the early church was? Especially once that guy Cornelius was baptized and they started just letting anybody in. Carol. Change. Okay, what kind of change, Mike?
Well, ignoring the law or the law not being important.
Okay. This Jesus stuff is great. We're glad he died on the cross for us, but we really need to be keeping the law. We really need to still be keeping this Sabbath stuff. We'll let the Sabbath pass and, we'll celebrate the resurrection and do this stuff. But if you're really spiritual, if you really want to please God, you need to keep the Sabbath too. You need to do all of this stuff. And so I think that's one of the reasons this story shows up in the Gospels that are showing up around the time that the church is starting to grapple with this issue. For those early Christians to read about, here's how you understand what Jesus thought about the law and about the Sabbath. And they're good for us because we get our traditions, we get our little rules and ways of doing things, and miss compassion, heart for God, thinking about others, serving others. Just the whole idea that the Pharisees would object to somebody being healed on the Sabbath. We read through the story, we've heard this story. It's mind-blowing when you stop and think about how twisted their thinking had become to be furious because Jesus had healed a guy in a way that nobody else could do. It just underscores all of that. All right, we got, what do we got here? We got about 5 minutes. Well, let's look at this next section quickly, beginning in verse 12. And this is kind of this is where I would start chapter 6, and the next verses we're going to read are kind of the transition between chapter 5 and chapter 6. It says, one of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. And I'm going to stumble over the names, so I'm not even going to try. You know who these guys are. It's interesting reading commentators or commentaries trying to align these groups of names in the 2 or 3 places where they're listed. The folks who want to discredit scriptures can't imagine any way that the lists line up, and those that do a little bit of study, see that, this Judas, son of James, was Thaddeus, okay, and that, there's a way to line these guys up. I don't want to get bogged down by that. I would like to maybe chat for a couple of minutes about why did Jesus go up on a mountainside and pray all night before he named these guys? Did he not know? Was he confused about who to pick and needed to pray about it? All right, get Casma first, and then Daryl.
The way that he lived his life, he submitted his will to God, and this was his way of communicating with his Father, the seal of approval, so to speak. He knew what needed to be done before it needed to be done, but this was his way.
Okay, but praying all night, man, that's pretty extreme. But I agree with you, Daryl.
I think she's absolutely right. We need to pray more, and it's an example for us to follow that we should consult God on everything that we do, all of our decisions. And
I agree 100%. Did Jesus need to pray about it? Okay, it's one thing, It's a good thing to do, and we ought to. Did Jesus need to pray about it? And Teresa had a comment.
Sure.
Don't let her get off the hook by not getting on the mic. She's got to get on the mic like everybody else.
Maybe it was he was praying for the disciples because we all know they needed prayers.
That's a great point. There's a turn now in Jesus' ministry. He's gone from being out there, sort of in Galilee and, in kind of the outer regions from Jerusalem and drawing crowds and going to little synagogues and stuff. But now the police have come from Jerusalem and they're out to get him. And he's headed now on a path. He's getting closer and closer to turning towards Jerusalem, where it's going to end at the cross. And he's going to name these guys to be with him, that he's going to train and be with, and he knows what's going to happen to them. So perhaps the thrust of his prayer was for them, okay? Which is great. And I wonder if really don't understand the decision process. And this we know that Jesus says, I'm one with the Father, and I don't do anything that the Father doesn't want me to do. And so I think there's some genuine communication going on about this decision. And I think it's also similar to a point we made about something else that Jesus did, was that he's like us. He's facing a life the way that we face it. And he's making big decisions. And they're just as big a decisions for him as the decisions that we have that we need to pray about. And so I think there's part of his humanness that's involved in this. And I'd love to tell you I understand it. I don't, okay? It's a mystery. But I think in Luke's telling of this story, he's continuing to paint a picture of Jesus that's in touch with the Father. It's not his own idea. He wasn't just this charismatic guy that started a movement, and he found these other really charismatic guys that he knew would be great, team leaders. These are ordinary folks. These are a diverse folks, the way our world would love to actually achieve diversity. Jesus did it and brought these guys together. And he begins that process by going and spending the night in prayer. Ronnie, did you have a...
I think Jesus did that every time he had a difficult decision to make.
Okay.
As an example, because his disciples knew what he was doing. They knew he was going off to pray. So I think he was trying to set an example for them also that this is important. You need to make sure that you're praying and getting close to God.
And I don't think he was just going through the motions. The human part of him needed to do that just like the human parts of us need to commune with the Father. And so it wasn't just, I don't have to do this, but I want you to see it, so I'm going to sit out in the dark all night and, I'm going to say and think stuff I really don't have to do. I think you really needed to do that. Okay. Matt. Then we got to wrap it up.
I think John 17 is, Jesus' prayer in John 17 is kind of enlightening about his relationship with these apostles, these disciples. He says, the Father gave them to him, and they believed that who he was. So there was an element there that the apostles needed to believe who Jesus was. And Jesus says, I protected them by your name. I brought them along. I showed them myself, and none were lost except the one who was doomed to destruction. Okay. So I think there's an element there that Jesus shared with the Father that maybe their future wasn't certain for some time. And they needed to believe and know who he was for things to go according to the Father's will.
That's a great point. Just like, and we talked some about this before, just like the disciples, when Jesus said, "Come follow me," didn't get up like robots and follow them like zombies. They had to make decisions all the way through about staying with Jesus, following him. And after he was resurrected and they're sent out to spread the gospel, they're not robots. They're making choices. They're on a daily basis making the decision to follow Jesus, just same way that we do. Only with a lot more opposition and a lot more violence, frankly. But they're still the making real decisions. And so I think whoever it was that said he was praying for them, the more I think about that, the more that makes sense that's really what that prayer was about, that it wasn't God, help me figure this out. Help me figure out who are the guys I need to name. I don't think that was the prayer. Okay. Gary.
David, I'm reflecting back on when he was tempted.
Okay.
And at the conclusion of that temptation, he said that the devil went away and looked for opportunities. Okay. And I think that would have been one of the other things that he was praying for.
Okay.
For himself and the disciples.
I'm sure that was in there.
What give a parallel between the devil and the Pharisees, since they were both looking for ways to get through the cracks?
Yeah, that would be a difficult sort of comparison. I think the Pharisees were given into the temptation to legalism and to, having their hearts turned away from God. But we'll leave that discussion for another class. Okay, next week we will start with the discussion about what's the difference between chapter 5 and chapter 6. And we'll look at the rest of chapter 6, which contains some very, very familiar verses. And we've had a lot of classes on the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain, so we may not go in quite as much depth on some of that, but we'll look at a couple of things, a couple of ways maybe of looking at this sermon that you haven't before. Not to change, but just to give a greater appreciation for it. Let's pray together. God, thank you for this evening. Thank you for your Son who declared himself and demonstrated by his words and his actions that he was the Messiah. And for his willingness and for his accomplishment of living the life that he did and sacrificing himself. For those that he named and sent out, who spread the word and shared the gospel that eventually came down to us and that we owe so much to. Just pray that you'll help us, that you'll guard our hearts, help us to never lose sight of compassion, never lose sight of what having a heart for you is about, as opposed to just keeping rules. Help us not to use circumstances to excuse things that we shouldn't do, but give us wisdom and discernment to make good decisions and things that bring glory to you. Give us a safe trip home, good rest tonight, and bless our actions and activities tomorrow. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.